It's January 20th, 2026. Russia is in the fourth year of its war against Ukraine. And today we want to take a look at the military situation. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is Build Situation Room. We begin in southern Ukraine's Zaporizhia region. New Ukrainian army videos show Russia pushing further toward the city of Zaporizhia, home to about 700,000. Let's take a look at the video. It clearly shows that from Primorsk, Russian soldiers are again moving northward here, typically in small groups of 2 or 3. In this particular case, they are all soldiers who were attacked by the Ukrainian defenders. That means we can see the Ukrainian army's kamikaze drones hitting here. But they're still just drones. That means we don't have Ukrainian defenders on the ground here stopping the Russian troops, but the Russians can be. Aerial attacked, but otherwise are moving northwards largely unopposed by ground units. And the footage we're seeing now clearly shows that the Russians have passed by Stepnohirsk along the dried up Karhovka reservoir. These shots of the wall and what looks like a dump or simple local facility in Primorsk clearly show a rather rundown, neglected looking site, but let us locate where the Russian army has pushed or managed to advance further north. Now let's take a closer look at the footage geolocated here, and that reached Primorsk. That means we're only 17 kilometers south of Zaporizhia, and how dangerous that is for the city of 700,000 people. We're going to look at that now. Take a look at the map. Russia is trying to push forward along the Karhovka reservoir, and in doing so they're attempting to bypass the Ukrainian troops who are holding the defensive positions here. And the footage, here we can see it just now from Primorsk. So as I said, the Russians have gone past Stepnohirsk and past many Ukrainian defensive positions as well that are set up here. And we can see the distance up in the corner, you can see the 7 kilometers marked. It's still about 17 kilometers to the big city, and 17 kilometers is absolutely no distance at all for Russian kamikaze drones. That means as soon as the Russians can pin themselves to Primorsk, I mean not just moving north with individual so-called runners, and there for the most part of course being killed by the Ukrainian defenders, as soon as they pull that off, they can station their Rubicon and other elite units there, which would then from there threaten civilians with kamikaze drones. They can be launched directly. And that's a huge problem for Ukraine, because we know as soon as these fiber optic guided drones with about a 20 to 25 kilometer range are in use, there wouldn't be a single Ukrainian vehicle safe anymore. Not a single Ukrainian even. An individual soldier moving from A to B, because the Russians could then basically attack the southern city districts directly with their fiber optic drones. And that's a big problem for the Ukrainian army. From Zaporizhia in the south of the country, we head to the Donetsk region in the southeast of Ukraine. There too, new videos show that the Russian invaders have once again pushed further forward. Specifically, they've advanced from Pokrovsk toward Hryshyn. Let's take a look at the footage. First, attacks on Pokrovsk itself. Here we also see many Russian soldiers. I'll mark them quickly so we can see lots of Russian soldiers moving through the town now. They've taken up quarters in the ruins of Pokrovsk by the hundreds, if not thousands, it would seem. Formerly 65,000 inhabitants, and we see that these soldiers are being attacked, but they can still keep moving around there. And these are soldiers who set out from Pokrovsk, from their logistics base, which is unfortunately what the city of Pokrovsk now has become, and they moved northwest from that very location. And now right across the different meadows and over these forest ridges here you can see it, reach Hryshyn. So we've got footage from the Ukrainian army showing the first houses in Hryshyn are barely being defended. We can still see some trenches, for example, where presumably just weeks ago Ukrainian soldiers were dug in. By now it's fairly clear to see, not just from the Russian flags, but also from these ruins here, that the Russian army has reached Hryshyn and is now moving into this suburb of Pokrovsk. On the left, you can briefly see again that there are still some Ukrainian soldiers in this house. We see this house is marked green, and we also see at the last moment, you see the Russian about to enter this abandoned Ukrainian position, getting shot from the house. We also saw the muzzle flash, so it's pretty clear there was an impact near the Russian soldiers, very close to their position indeed. However, that's the only sign of Ukrainians we see here, in this house itself and in the first house in Hryshyn, with nothing else at all visible nearby. More footage, sadly, shows us that those ruins we just saw are also being walked through by the Russians, that they're continuing to move through Hryshyn, that now on this street we just saw they're going house to house, which suggests that in just one day or at a certain time, well, we can see it here too, that the Ukrainians still occupied the first house, set up that ambush there, but in the days after they no longer did, so the Russians pushed further in. The Ukrainian soldiers who had still tried to hold the town entrance there have since pulled back. It all ends, as so often, in death, but we mustn't forget, these are Ukrainian videos, Ukrainian PR videos too, showing us the successful attacks. They show us what was achieved, namely the killing of Russian soldiers, as clearly shown. We also see, I think, here, this continuously updating counter that shows how many Russians the Ukrainians say they have killed here up to this point. Of course, it's not just 6 or 7 Russians in the end who attack Hryshyn, but, and that's what many Ukrainian soldiers on the ground tell us, it's 10, 20, 30 a day who in these tiny groups try to push forward and bring the next town under control relentlessly. Let's take a slightly closer look at this right here on the map and see where these shots were just taken. And you can pretty clearly tell that Pokrovsk is hardly contested anymore, that it's for the most part under Russian control, and that the Russians don't have that far to go anymore. It's roughly, as you can see on the display up there, it's about 5 kilometers from the outskirts of town all the way to Hryshyn itself, roughly speaking. The area is contested, so it's genuinely realistic here. Our map provider, Deep State Map, which provides this service and shows, yes, the first clashes are already taking place in Hryshyn. We saw Ukrainian soldiers still holding the outskirts, while elsewhere Russian forces push further in. Again, we can't say for sure. Did the Russians dig in here? Did they take the place over? Or were they all killed in the end and the survivors fell back those 5 kilometers? We can pretty clearly say that we're seeing fewer and fewer videos of Ukrainian soldiers, even from the Skala regiment inside Pokrovsk itself in recent times, as an ongoing trend. You can roughly mark the city limits here. In the past few days, there have been fewer videos showing anyone still holding positions or Russian soldiers being killed inside the city. What we're seeing instead is the fighting pushing further and further north, moving northwest, and so the worst case scenario has already come true. Another former town of about 65,000 people, with all its established infrastructure, is now being used as a logistics hub and as a launch pad for further attacks by the Russian army. Still, the situation around Pokrovsk remains extremely dangerous for the Russians. We can clearly see this in another video from the Ukrainian army, which shows the attack on a logistics transport truck. Here we can see how in 2026 the Russian army is moving its soldiers up to the front lines now. These aren't tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, or any other armored vehicles. It's just an ATV with plain trailers hitched on. Nothing more than that, really, just very basic and unadorned. About 5 or 6 soldiers move up to the front, with 2 sitting on the quad itself, right there, exactly 3 or 4 in the trailer here. And you can see just how unbelievably dangerous that is for the soldiers. So there's absolutely nothing left at all. No armor, no net, nothing whatsoever standing between them and the Ukrainian drones. The drone's now making its second pass, basically trying to take it over directly from high above, really quite straight overhead. And now we can see the attack on that trailer. Obviously the drone pilot aims for the spot where more Russian soldiers are. Here it's not the nonsense, it's the trailer. So overall this really is a complete disaster for the Russians. Moving to the front with no protection at all, and we've been seeing it for a long time, even before you reach the kill zone. Basically the last 10-15 kilometers, these supply convoys or columns or even single quads with trailers get attacked, and the Russians there are terribly decimated. From Donetsk in the east of the country, we move to the Dnipropetrovsk region, a bit more central, but still in the southeast of Ukraine, though without a border, I mean a real border with Russia. Here too, we have new videos showing the Russian army trying to push further. We've got footage initially from Ivanivka showing that the Russian army has apparently gained control of part of Ivanivka, the wooded area just outside the town itself. What we can see here is a single Russian soldier moving through this completely bombed out forest. So we can assume that hundreds, maybe even thousands of artillery shells and other munitions hit here to make it look like this, as we can clearly see now indeed. And we see the soldier moving here. You'll see that more clearly soon. We can make out on the ruins of a Ukrainian fortress that was actually set up here, as you can clearly see. We can take a closer look at the whole thing right now. There are pretty much signs everywhere that this is indeed a large fortress complex. There are openings all over the place here that were built deep underground. So this used to be a notably massive and highly extensive Ukrainian defensive complex on the north bank of the Vovcha. We'll see that on the video in a bit, right, in Ivanivka, to hold the Russians back here. But the Russian army bombed it so heavily and damaged the Ukrainians here so badly that you can now approach it with just individual soldiers. And what you can't achieve with bombs, because they're either not powerful enough or not precise enough, they're now trying to achieve here with mines. So the Russian soldier, as we can see here, is right now actively throwing his TM-62 mine directly onto the entrance of the Ukrainian bunker. You can maybe see it didn't quite go in. He missed from just a few meters. Of course, he's afraid there are Ukrainian soldiers inside who might shoot back. So he didn't dare get all the way up close. Nevertheless, we're about to see the very first explosion right at the surface. And then after that first explosion, the Russian dares to move closer. Now we see the second shell hits right at this entrance to that Ukrainian fortress and then explodes here. We don't know if there are still Ukrainian soldiers inside at that time. If they're in there, it's probably pretty bad for them, to be honest, seriously. They'll either be wounded or they'll be killed during this attack. We don't know for sure. In any case, you can see that where there was only a single hole, there are now these structures that were exposed here. We can see, this is a large fortification. All around here, there are tunnels under the ground that connect those different holes. And the Russians are basically clearing those tunnels now by detonating mines inside them at this very moment. And the whole thing is pretty devastating for the Ukrainian side. Even so, we can also see it's just a single Russian soldier. So even here where you think you've got the upper hand, even here where you think you've blasted it to rubble so you can just move right in, even there, Russia doesn't have 20, 30, 50 men like you might expect in other wars. Instead, it's individual, extremely vulnerable Russian soldiers whose lives apparently aren't worth that much, it would appear to be the case, who are being pushed right up, brought forward and shoved into position to then destroy these particular installations here on site. Let's take a close look at this on the map, see where Ivanivka is and why it's such an important location within the Dnipropetrovsk region. And we can see we're actually right on the border between Donetsk here in the south and Dnipropetrovsk here in the north, as you can clearly see right now. We can also clearly see this dashed line right here. So this is the line, the border between these two Ukrainian regions on this particular map view. And here too, I hope we see the Vovcha River. It's running along here pretty much right on that line, so they've drawn the border straight on the boundary river, following that exact line between the two sides. Here you can see Ivanivka, one of the three main larger villages in the region. What we just saw were footage from over on this side. In the northeast of Ivanivka, there, the Ukrainians' defensive position, which was specifically meant to stop Ivanivka from being taken, Ivanovka had already been partly captured by Russia. The Ukrainians pushed them back, and you can clearly see it in the blue. It shows this really well. Ivanivka is, as I said, one of three places the Russians want to take. The second is Novopavlivka. Our current information indicates that there are no Russian soldiers there. They were pushed back and are currently regrouping to the south of the town around Filia, according to our latest reports. And a third location we have here called Havrilivka, and that place is still entirely and completely under Ukrainian control. Let's take a look at what the Russians are doing, typically what they do when they haven't yet. They've had individual soldiers bomb those towns and pretty much shoot them to pieces relentlessly. Here we see footage from Havrilivka released by the Russian army showing FAB 500 bombs, that is guided glide bombs, striking the town center or village center. We can also pinpoint it pretty well. So that's roughly around the administrative building and right around the school. We saw it's a bit more on the west side of the village. So basically the exact spots the Ukrainians would be living in, broadly speaking, to have sufficiently fortified positions so at least they're not being hit by small kamikaze drones. In these tiny single-family houses, it's even easier to destroy the building's entire structural integrity. Instead, the Ukrainians are using the reinforced structures in the villages, which of course were almost completely abandoned by the residents because of the Russian aggression. And so we're seeing in Dnipropetrovsk, in this region, both in Havrilivka, in Ivanivka, and in Novopavlovka, the Russian army is attempting to press its forces further forward. If all three of these places are successfully captured, they could then push on toward towns like Meshova, for example, and maybe later Pavlohrad, and that is currently the Russian objective in this particular area. We're heading back to the Donetsk region to take a look at some new footage of a robot. Footage shot by a ground-moving robot. These clips were released by the 93rd Brigade, which is currently defending Kostyantynivka, and we can see that this robot is out on the streets at night, moving cautiously through the darkness. On the very, very dangerous roads around Kostyantynivka, and here it detected a Russian loitering drone for the first time. The robot is now driving around that drone, so it keeps going back and forth basically behind it, and it hopes and manages to get hold of the fiber optic cable, which you can show briefly, that's coming out the rear of the drone here, and it leads straight all the way back to the Russian operator. The robot's trying to destroy that fiber optic cable. It has cut it, run over it, so the drone can no longer be controlled. He actually succeeds. You can see it here now. It keeps driving back and forth so that, and this is basically the Ukrainians' proof, and in just that moment a Ukrainian vehicle drives past here. Here we can see it. There the vehicle drove past. The drone, a bit hard to make out. You can see the rotor down here, so that's the vehicle. The drone doesn't lift off, which for the Ukrainians is basically the signal. The operator, the Russian, either can't see what's happening at all anymore, or he's at least lost control. So that means this drone was just shut down by the robot. The whole thing's about to happen again. With another drone. So the robot is patrolling streets, going scene to scene, but now, and this is going to get pretty nasty, it spots an explosion ahead. What caused the explosion we soon find out. The robot, or the operator a few kilometers away, can indeed see that too. The robot's driving over there now and can basically take a look at the situation first. What just exploded, what's going on exactly, and he actually sees at first glance exactly what I just mentioned, right? On the way there is yet another waiting drone. Once again the same maneuver as before, it is basically just going back and forth really. So we see a bit of the shaky camera and the whole thing getting cut up. And now he's arrived at the scene of the explosion. Here too he sees... Here you can see heavily wounded Ukrainian soldiers, 2 of them probably hit in a car or struck by a drone. Now lying wounded here on the street. The operator is calling for help now, and we can see another quad pulling up, a medevac mission, a medical evacuation for the Ukrainian army, with the team preparing to render aid. And we can now see 2 soldiers carefully hoisting the severely wounded onto their quad. And at the end we can watch the whole thing unblurred, and then, I hope you can see it now, and then, after both soldiers have been hoisted onto the quad, here we see it, take them away so they can get that medical treatment without further delay. And all of this shows us just how important these robots are, and not only the drones up in the sky, but also the drones or robots on the ground these days, both for attack and for logistics in today's operational contexts. And also, as we saw in this case, for reconnaissance and for countering ground drones or loitering drones that are being used there. Let's look again at the map and see how dire the situation is now for the Ukrainian army in Kostyantynivka. We just saw this robot basically neutralize 2 loitering drones, and a 3rd suspected loitering drone or some other explosion hit the vehicle during that incident that came by. From the Ukrainian side. And why is that? We can see it here again from the scale and the current situation, depicted here clearly so you can more easily grasp the relative positions, timing, and the spatial relationships on screen. That Russian drones, and even the fiber optic guided ones, can be flown all the way to Kostyantynivka from everywhere. Each fiber optic drone has an effective operational range of at least 20 kilometers overall. And that's about it. And if we map it out, we've basically got the whole radius here, the entire area that can currently be reached by Russian fiber optic drones at the moment. And so there isn't a single safe place around Kostyantynivka for the Ukrainian army, for logistics, for resupply, for the soldiers moving around there. Of course, the same goes for the Russians. They're also at risk from these drones, likely stationed in Kostyantynivka by the hundreds or even thousands, or deployed there with Ukrainian units, and thus remain continually exposed to very serious and immediate danger. But that's a really crucial point. It's one reason for the Russians flanking this pincer strategy, that they don't push straight into the cities, instead approaching from the flanks and bypassing urban centers. It's not just about physically forcing the Ukrainians to withdraw on the ground eventually, and sadly that's already worked in dozens of cases. It's also about being able to set up hundreds of positions now with all your elite kamikaze drone teams, from which you can reach any place in Kostyantynivka, and the whole situation, as we just saw, indeed makes it extremely difficult for the Ukrainian defenders to respond effectively. From Donetsk we go to Kharkiv in northeast Ukraine. A new, rather sensational video released by the Russian army shows us an attack on a Patriot system. And I say meant to show, because it's still not 100% clear whether the Russians actually hit a Patriot system here, or whether it's some kind of decoy. We're seeing the approach of the so-called BM-35 Italmus drones. These are modern, remotely piloted drones operated by the Russian army. Kamikaze UAVs, delta-shaped like a Shahid, but they are smaller, have shorter range, but are also more maneuverable. And here we're seeing attacks on missile sites, as I said, of the Ukrainian army for southwest of Kharkiv. And that looks like Patriot systems at first glance. However, there are several convincing reasons to doubt the whole thing in general at the end of the day. Because the whole thing was looked into by Russian bloggers who said that if you take a close look at these legs here, for example, and also at some of the boxes here attached to it, then it's not really 100% like an actual Patriot system, if you will, strictly speaking. This is probably about hydraulic contraptions that are actually on this leg. I think I can pause it at the last second. That actually show up here. You can see it here, that it would need to taper toward the bottom before those plates are put down, so it basically doesn't sink into the snow at all, really. However, the whole thing isn't particularly clear. What speaks for it being an authentic Patriot system is that the Ukrainian president only just said a few days ago they've now received 2 new German systems, both of which have been deployed, and they've also received missiles for them, he explained. Of course, it's entirely possible that Ukraine received new decoys at the same time and went ahead and put them up there. Again, we can see what I was talking about. These legs that should taper here, getting thinner at a certain spot, you can clearly see it now, right here in this exact area, just like I mentioned. That didn't happen here. There's something a little off. If they're replicas, they're extremely good replicas, extremely expensive ones too. But the whole thing, like I said, isn't 100% clear. Another thing that suggests this wasn't a successful attack is that we don't have any video from a recon drone. That means we don't actually have a Russian drone over it, watching the whole thing, filming it, filming fires or explosions, rocket fuel, and so we can't say for certain until the very end whether it was actually a Patriot system that got hit here or not. At the end, we also see that one of the drones doesn't hit exactly here. We can see that pretty clearly. Here's another launcher from the Patriot system, and we see the drone therefore doesn't hit the launcher. Instead, it hits the snow next to it. The whole thing, like I said, is kind of strange. If it had been a successful strike and we could be 100% sure Ukraine lost a system or several launches, we'd likely have seen a Russian video, which would have shown the explosion from above. But the Russian army is launching devastating kamikaze drone attacks, not only in Kharkiv, but also in western Ukraine. We have a video from Chornomorsk. That's a Black Sea port in Ukraine's Odesa region, meaning it's located, in fact, only a few kilometers away from the Romanian border. And here we see the Ukrainian army's desperate attempts to fend off a Shahed attack during the night. You can clearly see anti-aircraft fire from several positions, and the cranes are visible. There are probably freighters and other ships from other countries docked there that you can clearly see. Either pick up grain or, supply Ukraine with various goods. And here we see this massive explosion. So we just saw the anti-aircraft fire, but the explosion, well, here you can see it right on the ground, directly between those cranes. And all of this, unfortunately, points to another direct hit. The Russians have just scored here with one of their Shahed drones, maybe even with several. And all of this, unfortunately, reflects the situation. We also hear from Ukraine that many, indeed, critical infrastructure, not just ports, but bridges and power plants too, even in the region. And that's why they're being hit daily, which is making it increasingly harder for Ukraine, especially to keep its electricity supply running reliably and on a consistent basis across large parts of the country.